Hey now, you're listening to the VoIP Users Conference from the IP Communications and VoIP community. We're at vuc.me on the web. We'd like to extend our thanks to Symwood.com. Symwood's API can turn a developer into a telco. Our hosted PBX and support is provided by onsip.com. The website is hosted at bluehost.com. Where would we be without ZipDX, full-featured HD audio conference bridge? And local rate dial-ins provided by voxbone.com. And of course, thanks to all of you participants who make this worth doing.
This is Michael, and I'll try to get my camera up. And welcome everybody to VUC number 500. It's the 1st of August. We have a very distinct handoff to Randy, who will get us started.
Okay, thanks, Michael, and thanks for the millions of times that you've done the roll-in and your own hosting and everything else. Michael Graves has been fantastic, and I hope he'll be able to take the spotlight more often, because I'd like to get into my old man stuff and stop this from time to time. Anyway, we are honored. This is VUC 500. We've done actually more than 500 of these. And we have the current CTO of the Federal Communications Commission of the United States, Dr. Henning Schulzrinne. Welcome to the call.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Okay, and I just one word about the FCC. About 50-some years ago, I was getting RF interference, RFI, on our home hi-fi. Wasn't even stereo yet. And I went over to talk to the ham radio operator next door, and within about 24 hours, he had me studying for my ham radio license. And eventually, we tooled over to the Seattle Federal Communications Commission, and I took my 13 words a minute Morse code test and the written test, and that was my first experience with the FCC. At that time, the FCC was involved in United States licensing of broadcast, of course, and also amateur radio, and eventually citizens band and so on. And I mention that because, first of all, it's pretty hilarious that I've been licensed by the FCC for over half a century, but also that the FCC's role has changed. Now, we're not here, as far as I know, to talk about anything related to net neutrality or things like that, but I would like to talk briefly about the FCC's changed role. But before we do that, as I warned you, Henning, wanted to ask you how you even got into technology, because I already said just now how I did. How did you get into technology in general? What brought you in?
So it's a bit of a peculiar story that I actually started probably as an exchange student when I was in Livermore, California, that some of you know as kind of the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. I was an exchange student there in a host family, and my host father was a nuclear physicist at Lawrence Livermore Lab working on nuclear fusion. And so this was in the late 1970s, and so he actually had a terminal at home, and it literally was a terminal, like one of these old punch tape type of terminals, 300 baud, I believe, at the time. And so I learned Fortran programming on a DEX system connected to the Cray 1 at the time that the lab had, and he had some spare cycles on that. I could do a little bit of programming, and so that kind of got the bug in me, and then I continued doing that, and slowly by happenstance through signal processing and other intermediary steps ended up in networking.
Okay, and from there, I guess the next part of it, now you've let me see, how am I going to frame this? Well, first of all, way before your involvement with the FCC, you were heavily involved in the advent of SIP itself and RTP, right?
Right. So as a grad student, I was working on a research project at UMass that was a DARPA project, and it was just about the time when the first M-bone broadcast, kind of, I guess, an early versions of what you're doing here was happening. So, and I was working on real-time communication issues, got interested in some of the protocol work, and then started as it became clear that we needed more than just software to do that. So we had a variety of Lawrence Livermore lab and others, including myself, had written software for doing video communication for primarily multicast at the time. And so we then got I got involved in the Boston IETF, where we started the AVT working group on RTP, where nobody cared at the time. It was also seen as kind of exotic. And then one thing led to the other, because it's had the recognition that we needed more than just transmission. We needed a signaling mechanism, which then led to SIP in the mid-90s. And I've been involved in one way or another since those days. And so that actually more or less naturally, and I'll talk a bit about that in a few minutes, by historical kind of happenstance and just timing, it turns out that a fairly large part of the non-wired, non-wireless piece of what the FCC does these days has actually a SIP and voice over IP connection. That's really, I would say, probably, roughly speaking, if you look at the portfolio, anywhere between a third or more, what keeps us busy at the Commission is in some way a consequence of the transition to voice over IP. So the other big piece that we do now, you mentioned it a little bit, and we still do that, is media-related issues. So I'm not going to talk much about open internet, but as you know, we had a comment cycle in for the open internet comments. We got more than 1 million comments that my colleagues are sorting through at the moment. And that had been compared, and that's in some sense a combination of the older FCC and in some sense the newer one, that the previous record for comments that we had received, although it's not a rulemaking in that case, was for the famous Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction at a Super Bowl a few years ago, where we, I think, got 1.5 million people who wanted to let us know their opinion about that particular incident. And because we do still, for broadcast, still have a somewhat of a muted regulatory role in that sphere as well. So one of the things you learn when you work in government is you don't get to just pick the hot new topics, or lots of things that most of us would consider not the most modern technology still is very important to people, and it continues to be a source of issues that need to be addressed.
Okay, now, when I was a kid, first of all, we didn't have dials. We had operators. We asked for the number first when I was a little kid. Then I recall very much that my mother wanted to call her sister in another area, and they didn't have area codes then. This was probably let me guess, the 50s. Yep. I'm pretty sure you're going to want to talk about numbering, and that's why I'm bringing this up. Eventually, there were area codes, and of course, the world started getting phones, and it's kind of chaotic in that the United States, well, the other thing is the first phone number I remember had about 6 digits, and I'm talking national, phone numbers all over had 6. We moved to area codes and all that. What would you like to move into today as far as comparing numbering systems? How relevant are they? And someone else just posted something today saying, should we even bother with numbering when we've got things like SIP URIs? So,
and I'll And that's a perfect lead-in to some of the topic, one of the topics at least, that I want to talk about, and certainly I hope to get into some discussion about. So I don't know if you'd like me to get started on kind of a more structured part of a presentation. I can certainly do that if you like, or we can just do it in a more conversational style.
No, that's fine. I'd be happy. We'd all be very interested in seeing what you had to present. I just kind of set that up because I'm an old guy, probably the oldest person here, and I do recall that way back there weren't even numbers, and then there was short numbers, and then there were longer numbers, and now it's all kinds of things. So let's go into your presentation about the numbering.
Okay, numbering and other topics. Let me do that. Let me switch to sharing screen. Okay, can everybody just see my screen, or my slides at least?
Not yet.
That's the problems here. Randy, you might need to reload your page.
And if I do that, what happens to the ZipDX and all of the rest?
I'll code them back in.
Okay. Okay,
yeah, it shows on the me page, I see my slides, so...
All right, folks, this is the bleeding edge. Thank you. So reload the page, right?
Yes.
There we go.
Yes. So let me call the ZipDX back in.
Okay, well, we're waiting for that. Cluecon.com next week.
Now joining in wideband, now muted. Press *6 to unmute. 19 other participants.
We're ready.
Okay, I hope everybody can see.
You are now unmuted.
I can see the slides.
Yes.
Good. So what I wanted to do today is kind of just highlight essentially some of the consequences that have happened because of that transition that really has taken place in the technology world and technology side many years ago. Obviously ongoing WebRTC and all of those, but is now really hitting the national scale and the political and legal and economic side of things as well as highlight that while we tend to think of communication as kind of one thing, namely kind of video conferencing or one-to-one phone calls, that there are important and interesting niches that we should probably look at and that really haven't received as much attention. And I'll talk briefly about a service that many of you may not be familiar with, but is probably the largest interoperable video conferencing service, namely the video relay service. So let me talk a bit about the FCC. We already started down that road. I won't bore you with all the legal and historical background, but I think it's helpful to say what we do and particularly what we don't do. I'll talk about the technology transition, which is our short name for a range of things that are actually happening where really the IP transition to the PSTN, the public switch telephone network, is the dominant force right now, numbering as mentioned. And then kind of two kind of the worst of days, the best of days type of thing. I didn't do that contrast intentionally, but it just happened to present itself that way. Namely, one way you could argue that the nuisance of illegal and otherwise annoying telemarketing calls known as robocalls, where SIP can be seen as really the technology enabler. And that obviously wasn't quite anybody's intention, but certainly the one kind of call that is now 100% voice over IP, almost guaranteed, is your robo wake-up call or your robo dinner call in that. Even a large part of the other parts of the voice network are still legacy. So the bad guys have certainly been early adopters, shall we say, of that technology for cost reasons and others. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about video relay services because, again, that's probably something most people unless you're deaf or hard of hearing, know very little about. I certainly, before I joined the commission, in my current role, didn't really know anything about it. I'd barely heard about relay services and teletypes and so on, TTYs in that. And there's some interesting technical challenges which I think would benefit by broader involvement from the technology community. And we are in a technology transition there to WebRTC type of systems there as well. So we look at what the Commission does traditionally, both organizationally and in terms of just policy issues. We had a bunch of stovepipes. So we had radio and TV, and indeed one of the motivators for when the FCC has been around for about 80 years now was the issue that you had essentially an air war going on when AM radio took off, where new stations came on board. There was no frequency coordination. Everybody tried to outblast the other guy so that they could get audience share, and it was just complete chaos. And that, as well as in the predecessor moment, to say before the FCC itself came on board, and another regulatory effort which came to be after the Titanic accident, namely where the lack of radio coordination led to, or contributed to, rather unfortunate loss of human life. Certainly wasn't the cause, but the lack of interoperability made it worse. So the Commission has for many years had these stovepipes where we have a media bureau that deals with radio and TV. We have a set of services that, again, that most of us don't really pay much attention to, but is very important still, land mobile radio, which is a Motorola walkie-talkie that firefighter, EMT, or policeman has on his lapel. And then we had the public switch telephone network, the classical phone network, and then cable TV more recently, and most recently data type services as well. And obviously there are other ones as well that these are just examples. So I'll just give an example of something that I was unaware of during World War II. The FCC actually had an active role in the war effort monitoring enemy radio transmissions before the NSA, for example, and other intelligence agencies exist. The FCC right now is a civilian agency, has no such responsibilities at all. So, but that was an early part of the history and that. So what we're now, with IP coming on the scene, we're now really converging into, instead of having these stovepipes, everything starts to look pretty similar, where the content matters less. So we have general purpose spectrum, which is another part that deserves a whole lot, another discussion, and I won't have time to do today. And general purpose networks as opposed to TV networks and radio networks and data networks and telephone networks and so on, so that all of these systems are now affected in one way or another by that transition. So let me talk a little bit about why do we actually typically in almost all countries that have at least a somewhat functioning government structure end up with policy and regulators of some sort or another. The classical model is a market failure problem. Namely, so you often in communication end up with a private monopoly. So, for example, in almost all countries, you had a monopoly with PTT, with Deutsche Telekom, and the postal service / telephone companies in most European countries. In the US, you had the Bell operating companies as monopoly local phone companies. And you have competitive market failures. So you have, in many countries, you now have, even if you don't have just one, you often have only two operators in the wireline world. In the US, in many parts of the country, you have essentially the cable company and the phone company, traditional phone company. So what the FCC does today is we do merger reviews. So the big one that we're looking at today, that colleagues of mine, I'm only peripherally involved in doing, is Comcast and Time Warner Cable. Before that, we had the Comcast NBC, which is a TV station for those of you outside the US, AT&T and T-Mobile, attempted merger, T-Mobile and Metro PCS, and so on, and AT&T and others that are going on, DirecTV and so on that are going on today. So merger reviews are a large part, and they usually encompass both technical aspects, understanding what impact that will have, as well as obviously largely economic considerations, as well as their social policy objectives. For example, there isn't really a market for relay services, the ability for people who are deaf or hard of hearing to get access. It would be unaffordable by individuals if they wanted to self-provision that, and there's never been like a commercial service that offers that. So how do you ensure people that are relatively small in numbers and can't otherwise get at reasonable terms services, how do they get integrated into society? Or universal access, namely, this has been true in almost all kind of broad-based utilities. You look at electricity, for example, generally speaking, large parts of the country are served, in the U.S. at least, and many other countries, by commercial other non-governmental entities, or at least only at best pseudo-governmental entities, without any subsidies. But in many parts of the U.S., being relatively sparsely populated, there's just no way that either electricity or telephone service would have arrived all on its own. It's just too expensive to do that. And so if you want to ensure, as a matter of national policy, that everybody has access to electricity and phone service, for example, you can't just rely on market forces to do that. There's also a law enforcement issue. So there is both illegal and unsafe conduct. So illegal conduct, we see a fair amount. Recently, for example, you heard about, there was a congressional hearing about so-called cramming, where various premium SMS services show up on your phone bill for horoscopes and celebrity gossip that you maybe inadvertently or otherwise even not signed up for, and you get billed for those. There's good old fraud that you had in one of the programs that I'll talk about, video relay service, of the government being defrauded as well. And then you have unsafe conduct. So, for example, you in the communication realm, even though we don't think of that as a safety issue, there are at least two potential safety concerns primarily related to radio communication, namely on the back of every phone and toaster and anything else that uses electricity, you have a little FCC stamp, right? The F, where there's two nested C's in it. And we don't test as to whether the device is good, functions well, or whatever. We do test whether it doesn't interfere, that was mentioned earlier, and importantly for intentional emitters, meaning radios, actually cell phones and other devices, that it doesn't exceed certain emission limits, so that you don't put inadvertently a little microwave oven in your pocket, in your pan pocket. And so we have limits that are established by a rulemaking process as to how much electromagnetic emission is tolerable based on what the science is supposed to say. There's also consumer education one. So one of the problems is that often for many items, consumers have a hard time understanding what they're being offered. So this is why outside of telecommunication, you have things like lemon laws for used cars. And then you have a classical public goods problem where no individual actor is sufficiently incented to do certain things, such as scientific research, because they cannot capture the value of that. So that's often known as public goods because you can't easily contain the benefits of those. And since everybody hopes that somebody else does, say, the research, it doesn't get done at all. So everybody is worse off, but there's no real mechanism to deal with that. Patents do that to some extent, but they're only effective in some areas, not for longer term scientific research, for example, and other type of areas. So all of these apply to communication as well. In different forms, and so you'll see a little bit of that in there. So the FCC is a creature of Congress. I'll just point out without going in great detail is that you have a set of kind of a hierarchy of rules that govern how people and companies can behave. We tend to think of laws as kind of that does that. In practice, if you've ever flown, you get the announcement that you have to obey all signs and placards and FAA regulations, and those are indeed captured in the US in a big, thick rule book, and it's all public. You can look them up. It's about 5 volumes or so that are sitting on my bookshelf at my office that govern anything from radio transmissions to economic issues for some phone companies to indeed open internet rules as well. And so that's what the FCC and other regulatory entities typically do. They write those rules in that. I won't bore you with org charts, but the FCC has about 1,700 employees. It's divided into a consumer and governmental affairs that deals with Congress and consumers, enforcement. So we actually have people in field offices we mentioned earlier, like Seattle, for example, and New York City and other places, that will come knocking at people's doors, TV stations, and might be good old pirate enforcement, pirate radio enforcement, and all that. And they're not law enforcement agents in the typical sense. They typically work with federal marshals if that is necessary, if people with guns are needed. But they do have the power to make your life very unpleasant by leveraging very large fines that could be we have leveraged fines of multiple millions of dollars to large providers. And typically it starts at a few $1,000s for more minor offenses. And then we have an international bureau that deals with satellite issues, a media bureau deals with cable, a public safety and homeland security that deals with 911. I'll talk about that a little bit. A wireless, telecommunications, pretty obvious, spectrum, and wireline, which is the phone service. The actual people that make rules are 5 commissioners. So currently we have 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. So it's not a typical federal agency, an independent agency, so it doesn't have a secretary of type of title. And so they vote on these items in monthly meetings, which are public. And everybody else, the other 1695 people on some way or another, they don't really have any direct authority, leaving some of chiefs aside. So this is an example that all of you are familiar with, namely this is the so-called Part 15 rules, which is essentially the Wi-Fi enabling rules in that. So we make these rules based on any number of inputs. Again, I won't go into too much detail here, but it is not just kind of we think it's a good idea and we do it. We have to ask for public comment for every single action of any significance. That is not just a strict enforcement of existing rules, but anything new gets public input that I mentioned earlier before we started, namely that sometimes large numbers, usually much smaller numbers. If you're familiar with the IETF process, you can kind of squint at this slide and you'll see that actually this is not altogether different from a standards-based process, that you have essentially a set of steps that a little more formal sounding than your typical internet draft, but you can think of those in some rough way. That there is an analogy that I found striking, that in many ways the process that, for example, as involved in the IETF or SIT Forum or any of the standards bodies isn't altogether different, although most people there probably have never worked in a regulatory agency, than what has emerged in at least the US model for public comment and review and all of these type of issues. That seems to be kind of one of these natural things that has to happen unless you have a dictator for life. Let me talk about the IP transition a bit, because that's one of the main topics. Namely, what we have happening, and that's again something that many of us, because we only see bits and pieces of that, haven't seen as much, is that we really have 3 things happening all at once with different implications. So we have one that we are probably all familiar with, is namely TDM voice is quickly becoming voice over IP, and voice over LTE is eventually one of these days, whenever they get around to it, will start to dominate. We'll have but we also have, and that's important in many technical and non-technical ways, we have a transport network transition, namely one transit where TDM circuits still, and to some less extent analog circuits, are still not visible to the average consumer, but rather important. For example, something I didn't realize is that, talking about the FAA, a large part of air traffic control being fairly distributed, since when you pilot, when you're on United on Channel 9, you listen to the communication between the cockpit and flight control. You can't obviously have one big radio in Washington, D.C. That illuminates the whole U.S. sky. You have radio stations, little radio repeaters all over the U.S. that pick up the FM. It's FM band transmission. In the 100 megahertz type of range, and that's all connected by telephone lines, obviously, to regional centers. That transition is happening, and you have a much bigger diversity where in the old days you could, to first approximation, assume that the communication network on the local level, obviously the wide area has been fiber and microwave to some less extent for many years, but on the local level was essentially copper only for communication application, not for TV distribution. Now we have essentially hybrid networks everywhere. Every network that is of any importance is a hybrid network. So you have hybrid fiber networks that are mostly fiber, but obviously in-house Wi-Fi or coax. You have coax, hybrid fiber coax networks. You have wireless networks that are also essentially 99% fiber, and the last mile is licensed spectrum. And then you have copper twist pair still, namely the various fiber to the node type of models that are emerging, like AT&T Uverse and so on. So the network physically has gotten a lot more complicated, which has a number of consequences. If you look at the transition, there are really two taking place, and for time reasons, I'll only really talk about one of those. Namely, one is the transition of media distribution to IP, and I'm not talking about YouTube and Netflix here, where that's obviously kind of a given, but also that so-called IPTV that the cable companies are slowly transitioning their cable plans to distribute entertainment, linear entertainment video via IP packets as opposed to directly modulated on a digital channel, as been the case, or analog in some cases still. And the one that is of more relevance to the next few slides is the one that we talk about, the public switched telephone network, or just it's called public switched because they're used to as obviously private networks, and they're non-switched, like lines, dedicated lines to between, let's say, an elevator and a elevator company that are not part of the regular phone network. And so the distinction, the one is a public interest, is what's generally abbreviated as a PSTN. What's happening is, in some sense, a technical motivation, but in the end, it's all about money. I mean, one of the things you learn when you're at a regulatory agency is technology matters, money matters more. It's not that the motivation and more than the outside of changes generally has been, almost all of the cases here, has been really about, for example, the copper to fiber transition, about maintenance cost, the wire to wireless transition in rural areas, again, cost of not maintaining loops for copper loops, and the circuit to packet transition in the backbone and the voice network is largely about replacing expensive switches by cheap software. And they raise different issues. So you have, for example, in the old world, and this has been true in Europe to some large extent, as well as to a lesser extent in the US, is a fundamental model of how you ensure competition at the communication level, not just at app level, has been the so-called unbundling of network elements. So since 1996, in particular in the US and in Europe, somewhat more recently, the incumbent operator that had the telephone company typically had obligations to give access to their facilities, their copper loops, to competitors. that would offer services on top of those and do their own backhaul and so on, and the switching services and other services on top. So that allowed a new entrant that couldn't afford to rewire a whole country to provide services. That worked reasonably well in an environment where you had a single piece of copper running between a home and a business and a central office. It doesn't work so well when you have active equipment in the middle of a network transiting between a fiber network, say, and a copper network. You also have the wireless to wireless transition. Most people, and I suspect all of you on the call know, but we had essentially every household had two power networks. One that runs at 110 or 220 volts that you plug your refrigerator into, and one that runs at 48 volts DC that you plug your phone into. And because they were somewhat independent in terms of wires, certainly, and in terms of structure for about inside the network, you had at least a minimal power source even when utility power, commercial power went out. Obviously, in a wireless network or in a fiber-based IP network, that disappears, and people tend to get, in the US particularly, pretty concerned about that, given that the commercial power in many parts of the country is not as reliable as people would like. And then, again, that also affects the transition between circuits and IP packets. So when we look at the tech transition and overall, and just talking about the PSTN transition, we're really looking at network issues internal and between networks. So power, I mentioned, universal reach, reliability, consumer protection issues, and as well as inter-network issues, namely one of the classical problems that goes back well before, so to say, the history of what most people here experienced, namely the beginnings of the landline phone network. When AT&T got established in the US as the monopoly provider, is the biggest fights were between small companies, and there were lots of small phone companies initially, and every town had their own phone company pretty much. And the big provider, AT&T, didn't want to interconnect with those so that you couldn't dial between those local communities across long distance, simply because of lack of interconnection, since it was not in the interest of the large providers to make it possible for the small providers to deliver calls, since they would rather drive that small provider out of business and have all of it to themselves. So interconnection has been a continuing struggle since the beginnings of communication networks. The most recent version, in a very different ballpark, has been, some of you may have seen some of the discussion, the Netflix versus Comcast versus AT&T versus Verizon versus the other big broadband providers, which is at its heart an interconnection issue. You have issues of public safety and 911 in the US, and numbering as kind of universal identifier. That's, again, you can, without trying to go into a history lesson, you'll discover pretty quickly that there's a set of common recurring themes that as the technology changes, you always have identifier issues. We talked early on about the issue of numbering in phone systems, IP addresses, IPv4, IPv6, domain names like the ICANN issues. They all unavoidably seem to recur just in new clothes, so to say, in 50-year intervals. This slide shows one facet of a dramatic change in the U.S. telecommunication landscape. It is a measure of the billions of minutes in so-called interstate switched access minutes. So think of these as long-distance minutes in non-lawyer terms. And you see this started in 1985, and we're basically in 2012 roughly back to the 1985 levels of voice service. Now, that's partially because people seem to talk less on the phone, but it is larger, to a larger extent, that simply those providers buy local incumbent exchange carriers, think your Verizon, AT&T, Frontier, Windstream, CenturyLink, etc., that many people have switched, obviously, to other services. So in the US, about 40% of households don't have a landline at all anymore. and only about 5% of households only have a landline. So 95% of households mixed at least, or have only mobile voice services. And so the missing minutes, so to say, have transitioned to other services, including kind of IP-based services such as the one we're using now. One other facet is that we now have a very diverse landscape when we talk about broadband access. And one of the problems that often occurs in these type of discussions is that we tend to focus on a small set, namely big city type one, which generally in the US, about 20% of the population has two main non-wireless and main landline broadband choices and voice IP choices for that matter indirectly, namely fiber to the home, typically provided by Verizon Fios, in large numbers, a few other providers, smaller numbers as well, and the cable company. And then an additional 60%, so the cable company serves about 80% at high speed, is then combinations of fiber to the node, so this is UVerse and other similar technologies that gets you 10, 20 megabits, and then you get the cable guys. And then the remainder of the country gets split into some part of the country that only has DSL, low-speed DSL typically, a few megabits, and then satellite in some cases, and dial-up and other technologies that generally are kind of second-choice technologies in the sense that most people would probably prefer something else about. So the competitive and access landscape really differs dramatically depending on where you're talking about. So it's difficult and dangerous to extrapolate just from East Coast and West Coast, say, to larger swaths of the interior US, as well as more rural areas. One other interesting thing that has happened is that starting about in 2013, its numbers are a little hard to track because there are no precise definitions, but roughly speaking, the number of residential lines has decreased much more rapidly than the number of business lines. So we are now at a crossover point somewhere because with different evolution, since most businesses can't really easily use cell phones, for example, that you now have likely going to have most phones are actually business lines of some sort, rather than traditionally dominated by residential lines. One of the problems that people fear is that as traditional copper loops get displaced both on the DSL side and the voice side by primarily the cable ones or wireless for voice, that you have kind of a death spiral. Namely, that the maintenance costs are essentially given by the length of the wire. Right? It just takes as much to put it back up after a storm as it does when you have one customer on that line as it does when you have 50 on them. Not quite, but in first approximation. And so the proportional maintenance cost as you have fewer and fewer subscribers on those lines start increasing, meaning costs go up, meaning more people say, hey, I don't really need to pay $30, $50 for a voice line, so maybe wireless only is okay, or just use voice over IP because I need broadband anyway. And so you got now a potential death spiral for traditional landline. The other related problem that we have is that we have switches that in some cases probably approximate or predate the birthday of people who are on this call, namely most of the traditional modern switch, what we would call modern switches, were designed in the mid-70s to mid-80s maybe. And so one of the more popular ones, probably a third or so market share, if not more, is the Nortel line of central office switches, designed in 1979, no more manufactured, simply because Nortel is no longer with us. So way that parts are being delivered is by cannibalization. So switches, as they lose access lines, we use those line cards, and by my secondary market, shall we say, kind of the eBay model where people decommission old switches and then sell bits and pieces to providers that still use it. That's becoming a problem simply because you have systems, particularly for 911, that still use really old technology, so-called comma trunks. These are common announcement messaging something or other. And these are trunks that were originally designed for long distance operators, so they could see how much they needed to charge for a long distance call. Needless to say, we haven't had long distance operators in a while, but we still have comma trunks because they are able to deliver in a reliable way that is different from the way we typically do call ID, deliver calling number information to the destination, namely the public safety answering point, which then uses that to look up addresses, who's calling from where. And those comma trunks that nobody understands anymore because they're not built for anything except 911, and legacy switches have been a continuing source of trouble. You can see on the slide, this was about 3 years ago now, but we've had similar, we've had a very recent large-scale multi-state outage which was at least partially tied to those same trunks, namely one large provider of 911 services in the US as a kind of system service provider, a database of comma trunks ran out of numbers, and suddenly several million people in the western part of the United States had no access to 911 service for half a day or so. So what are some of the public safety related challenges that are to emerge? I'll talk a little bit about denial of service attacks that are now using telephone services. We have a notion that what we used for services for alerting and 911 is no longer universally available. Emergency alerting, for example. We have redundancy that's supposed to exist, but really turns out once you look under the hood, doesn't really exist. For example, I said a large part of the 911 system across multiple states by just incremental contracting decision all ended up in one place in Colorado, one software implementation and one database, and when that failed in an unpredictable way, suddenly lots of people lost 911 service. We also have issues such as location that I briefly mentioned a little bit. So the old model for emergency services that often assumed still is that you had a central office pictured on the left as one example, so kind of a hulking building with batteries in the basement. You had a rotary dial phone that didn't need a battery or electricity an external electricity beyond the line power to operate. You had people battery operated transistor radio, a TV, obviously not battery operated, but a TV station, TV that people actually watched. And all of that was available pretty much universally. So when people think about emergency services, they assume that people pick up a rotary dial or whatever phone that provides a precise address to the 911 center, a street address. You have, if it is a large-scale emergency like a tornado or an earthquake, even if the phone system is out, people have an FM radio, AM radio they can tune to, and they follow the news on TV. Obviously, reality looks a little different. When I look at my college-age son when he was at a college apartment, his equipment consisted of a modem, a smartphone, and a laptop. No TV, no radio, no line powered phone at all, and again, no landline phone for that matter at all. So that all of these assumptions were simply no longer true. We also have a lot more indirect 911, so we have like the Nest smoke detector. It doesn't dial 911 yet, but you could imagine that you have all these devices that could trigger calls to 911 that aren't human. How do you deal with those? There's security issues, there's what information gets conveyed, all of that. Do you have location information? All of those issues have not really been dealt with all that well. More recently, we run into the problem that one advantage that the U.S. 911 system had compared to just about every other country is that we had pretty good location delivery, both on wireline and wireless. On wireline, there's a database that even if you don't know where you are, let's say babysitter type of thing doesn't remember a street address when the baby that they're taking care of is choking and in panic, or a young child calling, or on wireless, if you don't know exactly on which road you're on, then you had location delivery mechanism that would indeed deliver that to you. That is no longer working nearly as reliably because now many of the wireless calls, because of substitution, are in a mode where they can't get GPS fixes, and many of these calls, people disagree as to how many, but probably at least 20% of those calls have no reliable location fix. You might know the cell tower, but that gets you in New York City, that gets you maybe a mile radius, so not terribly helpful unless there's smoke coming out of a building to know where that call came from. And so how do you deal with that? How do we integrate multiple location technologies? The pictures I show is, can you imagine putting, for example, a location beacon into exit signs and smoke detectors, into Wi-Fi access points, and so on? We also have a problem that, and this came up during the 911 outage I mentioned earlier, that it took several hours for people actually to figure out what was going on. The individual call center were noticing that it was awfully quiet there. There's nobody calling, but it was in the middle of the night, and they had no good way to figure out that there was a common problem that all traced back to the same source. They all naturally figured individually that they had some circuit issue locally, but that wasn't the case. So we don't have, at the moment, a national 911 monitoring system, for example, or even a statewide. I won't go into greater details, but things that we consider to be separate, such as fire marshals from the 911 system, now need to be integrated into that environment. Other things that we need to think about are, how do we maintain the notion that everybody still can retain telephone service? In a more competitive environment where you don't have a single dominant provider that can cost-subsidize, how do you make sure that people in more rural areas or low-income areas still can get phone service? How do you ensure public safety? I mentioned earlier, a lot of the public safety now alerting is based on dialing landline phone numbers. People don't have landlines anymore. How do you do that? How do you deal with quality issues? I talk about number spoofing a little bit. Oops. Let me say briefly universal service. The notion of universal service goes back to Vail, one of the co-founders of AT&T, or early presidents of AT&T, and the notion there was that you would have universal service regardless of where you are, even if it wasn't really economically on a per line basis to provide that service, simply kind of basic parts of civilization, if you like. And so we have rules in place in most of the U.S. called carrier of last resort. Namely, in every state, there's one carrier, typically the local phone company. If somebody shows up and say, I want phone service in my remote town or along a country road, you have to provide it. It's not an unbounded obligation, but pretty much wherever there's human habitation, the phone company has to run a wire there if necessary to provide you phone service. How does that work in an environment where you don't have necessarily the traditional motion of an incumbent local exchange carrier anymore? We have a universal service fund. It's about $8 billion in the U.S. It funds a variety of these things, but it can't fund everything. We also have a bunch of legacy services. We have legacy low-speed modem services, many of the credit card terminals that people use, particularly in smaller businesses, gas meters, teletypes. We have faxes, obviously, still. We have line-powered devices that don't have their own powering because they're built into, say, elevators. We have some so-called galvanic services where the phone wire is treated as a electricity delivery device or a generic piece of very long cable that you can run just about anything electrical over that's not connected to a switch. How do you deal with those? Some circuits are used not only for communication, but they're used for timing. So, for example, the FAA uses it as a high-precision source of timing information as a clock oscillator because T1 circuits have extremely stable clocks attached to them that generate a very stable and predictable frequency, and you can use that for all kinds of purposes. Now, we don't have that anymore necessarily if you transition to, say, Ethernet. Talk about numbers for a little bit. One of the problems that we've had is that we have, and was mentioned early on, is when we have SIP URLs, do we still need telephone numbers, for example? One of the issues that we, again, invariably tend to deal with is that we have a set of trade-offs between communication identifiers. Namely, we tend to have identifiers that are owned by a provider, so, or that are owned by the end user. So the Gmail one is my provider-owned one. So if you want to switch your email services from Google to Yahoo, for example, you suddenly can't take your email address with you. If you're lucky, Gmail will forward your mail, but that's about it. Or you can buy your own domain name, but most people don't seem to be able to or willing to do that for a variety of reasons. Some can do multimedia, some can't. Some have, and this is almost invariably a trade-off of more, so it's a human-friendly in some senses, but more trademark issues you get into. Numbers don't tend to have that issue. And you have kind of what you might call soft privacy. Many people don't use their real name as an email address because they don't necessarily want to reveal that to everybody that they email. And phone numbers are recognizable, but at least people believe, even though that's not really true, when you call somebody, you suppress call ID, obviously, that it doesn't directly map to your name or other identifying information. So that trade-off, I think, will continue to exist. And so my belief is that will ensure that telephone numbers will continue to play a role, at least for the foreseeable future, unless we have a completely fragmented system where you have to now specify which of 5 communication means you might be able to reach me at. That's not news to you, is that as we look at numbers, telephone numbers versus IP addresses, we have a fairly large set of a distinction that people often forget, particularly when we're talking about Internet of Things. We have a large set of items that are now numbered by telephone numbers, as opposed to, say, IPv6 addresses. And neither of them are probably appropriate, but it just was convenient to have those around. So what is the future of telephone numbers in particular? So should we treat numbers as equivalent to domain names? Should you just be able to buy a telephone number, just like you might buy right now an 800 number, and use it forever until you don't no longer pay your annual fee, say, for example, just like a domain name. You don't really own a domain name. You lease it in some sense. You license it. And if you stop paying, it goes away. And how do you deal with that in a phone number environment? Do you want Donald Trump to buy up all the 212 area code numbers as vanity and then speculate in those? Should numbers have a geographic component? In some countries, I know Germany does it that way, if you get a voice over IP number, you can only get a number and you have to prove that you live there in that particular area code, which are typically city-based. There's one city number area code. In the US, you obviously have a somewhat looser model. Cities don't have area codes, generally speaking. You have multiple area codes in the city, but you still have dominant area codes. I just happen to see, and this is what's on the picture, is that there are whole magazines that are denoted by the area code as the identifying characteristic. So 201 is, for example, northern New Jersey in that, and there's others along those lines that have essentially become kind of regional identities. We've had for a number of years the problem of call ID spoofing, and it's used for all kinds of mischief. It's generally illegal, but most of the people using it for nefarious purposes, it's not exactly a great deterrent. Most of the people using it are A, outside the US, and B, committing far greater crimes than spoofing a telephone number. It's like worrying about a parking ticket when you're committing bank robbery. So we've had an ongoing problem that providers of telemarketing services of mostly the illegal kind spoof numbers to make it more difficult to be traced and to impersonate other people for various fraudulent purposes. So, for example, we've recently had a case where somebody's been spoofing the number of banks to extract personal information from people they call, pretending to be a bank clerk, asking for your social security number, for example. Robocalling has become a well-developed industry with lots of participants, often located in multiple countries, that provide technical and other services to the masterminds, so to say, behind that operation. So it's typically you have dialers and you have call centers, typically in India, that do that type of do the actual human interaction and so on. So I mentioned consumer fraud and nuisance. One other problem that has occurred is many people are complaining that they're losing the use of their phone number because somebody spoofs their number, and they now get the legitimate person with nothing to do with that particular criminal activity gets now hundreds of phone calls saying, why did you call me to sell me a timeshare condo or a useless car warranty or whatever else it happens to be? And we've had people complain to us that they basically are forced to change their phone number simply because they can no longer use their old numbers since it's being abused by somebody else. We are now looking into models and a variety of people, both inside and outside the Commission, Federal Trade Commission, the FCC, and outside, are looking at how do we stop robocallers. It's hard to stop people making phone calls. We don't want that. It's hard to distinguish on their phone call level good robocalls from bad robocalls, or legal from illegal. And so think of alerting calls, airline announcements, flight delay calls. They all look pretty much like illegal robocalls in terms of volume and duration, all of that. So the only thing that you can really do is make sure that calls are labeled correctly, and then people can filter calls that they rather not receive, either individually or collaboratively. We need to prevent two kinds of spoofing. One which is used for impersonation, kind of a bank model. And secondly, one which is used for anonymization. That's typically used for denial of service attacks, where somebody does extortion or tries to commit extortion on, say, a hospital or a school or a nursing home or a public safety answering point. That's become disturbingly common, and they change their phone numbers so they can't be blocked to tie up all the phone lines. So this is an example of that. The Department of Homeland Security, the FBI have been warning about attacks on that particular, using that particular model ongoing, or the payday loan type of extortion and others that I won't go into. We have to deal with legitimate call ID spoofing. I'll skip that. For that, and we just get to the model. The model that's emerging is that we essentially need to sign SIP calls. This is what the STIR IETF group that I suspect Emil was at is looking at. So adding a signature to the SIP header, adding a SIP header field to the SIP invite, that would then provide identity information to entities downstream that can be validated so that it becomes clear as to whether the person claiming to make a call from a particular number is entitled to use that number. So think of a certificate that is attached to that particular number. We just so STIR is making pretty good progress on identifying the header issues. So we have to deal with, for example, deployability, that have to various SPCs that get in the way and munge around with call IDs and so on. We also have to deal with various authorities. We have to deal with legitimate spoofing. This is the a legitimate call center impersonating in a fully legitimate way another phone number that is assigned to their client, for example, and so on. Let me just, in the interest of time, move on a little bit. Also, on a short-term basis, we might look at models where we basically do, instead of authenticate every number, make sure that certain high-profile numbers that should not originate on the voice over IP trunks on certain providers don't. So, for example, most banks don't use random voice over IP gateways to originate their calls. So if a number like that shows up on a random voice over IP gateway with nearly 100% certainty, that number is not used legitimately. And so by essentially having a do not originate list, just like you have a do not call list, you could prevent much of that type of mischief. People impersonating Internal Revenue Service, which has happened, impersonating a local police station, which has happened. All of these could probably be prevented before we have STIR in action. So what do we do when those calls occurs? We can drop the calls, we can divert them to an IVR service, for example, etc. More generally, we're starting to look at creating a test bed for numbering issues as to how a future numbering system, which is really messy and complicated in ways that I haven't described, it's really a history kind of embedded in technology, can be modernized and simplified as well as made more attacker-proof in some ways, because the trust assumptions that we used to have no longer apply. Before I close, let me talk briefly about relay services, as I promised, since many of you probably not heard of those. So for many years, we in the US and in many other countries to differing degrees have had services that allow people who are deaf, hard of hearing, or have a speech disability to communicate with people who are able to speak and hear. And typically the way those have operated is in a relay mode. So somebody uses either text or American Sign Language, like on the picture shown on the right, with the help of a communication assistant, you can think of that as an interpreter, who will take what, let's say, is typed and voice it, and will take what is spoken by the hearing party and transcribe it into text so that the person who is deaf or hard of hearing can indeed communicate with somebody who is not. So one of the more popular services, TTYs used to be the most popular way of doing it. Those are fading for obvious reasons, but there is a fairly large community, about 200,000 or so users, that speak American Sign Language and other sign languages in other countries, which tend to be fairly similar. That is, you can think of it as its own language. It has its own grammar. It has its own way of sentence construction. But it can also use spelling, finger spelling that maybe you've seen on TV sometimes. And that is used then by an interpreter that is relayed between the hearing and non-hearing person. It's a regular phone number, so for those who care about these technical details, it's an enum service operated by a contractor of the FCC, NUSTA, that maps phone numbers, regular assigned phone numbers, to video relay IP users. You can dial those numbers. If somebody gives you a number that happens to be a video relay number, it looks like a regular area code, regular phone number. When you dial it, you will be connected to the communication assistant. They will say something like you've reached the whatever relay service and will be connecting to your party momentarily, and then you'll be talking through another person to the actual party that you want to talk to, and vice versa. It works pretty well. I've used it on occasion when we interact with people who are deaf. We have both staff and outside parties who use ASL, but it is a bit on the cumbersome side because it's not quite real time. There's also a service called IPCTS, Caption Telephone Service, that are primarily used by people who are late deafened, so they speak perfectly fine, they understandably, but they don't hear. The hearing aid is no longer sufficient, and they use a text rendition, again, done by human intermediaries who transcribe the speech into text that shows up on a dedicated device or on a PC, the picture you see on the bottom right. We are currently procuring, that may be of interest to some of you, bits and pieces of an all SIP-based, voice over IP-based system that we'll use to make the overall video and other relay services more efficient. We've in the midst of selecting a contractor for a neutral communication platform. I'll show a diagram of that momentarily. And we'll have issued a request for proposals that's still active for a video relay service user access platform that will be SIP or WebRTC based with an open source emphasis. This is a very rough picture of what the system to some extent looked like and will look like once we are finished. Namely, this is a video relay user agent sitting in the user's home, very much like what I'm using today to speak. Then a SIP proxy, a database that will be used for authentication that doesn't exist yet, a numbering database of the kind I mentioned, enum database, an automatic call distribution system, which reaches the communication assistance, or 911. You can call 911 that way too. Again, because most 911 centers, none of them actually don't, they don't speak ASL or don't have text, a few exceptions. And then there's typically these days, because we have a legacy set of H323 equipment, there's some H323 equipment out there as well. An example shown on the lower left. We are in a process of converting relay services to address some of the current problems. Interoperability. The SIP forum has a video relay service group that is trying to create a profile for a SIP-based video relay service. User choice, there's 5 providers right now. You sign up with 1 provider, so that inbound phone calls have to go somewhere. And we want to increase user choice. Currently, we have both text and video-based systems. We want to see if we can combine those and do true multimedia systems. We want to make IP-CTS, the caption telephone service, much more scalable. Right now, one of the problems is financial, so we pay for video relay service more than $5 a minute. No, it's not an hour, $5 a minute for the communication assistant and other related services, so that gets pretty expensive pretty quickly. And for IP-CTS, we pay less, but if everybody who could use that, lots of people getting older, losing part of their hearing, they're difficulty communicating by phone. If they all start using IP-CTS, we run out of money. And we have limitations of a relay model. It's like speaking through a foreign language interpreter, better than not communicating, but certainly not as good as native. So we are now working with federal agencies and others to ensure direct communication in sign language to somebody who's on staff to speak sign language. We've also had a fair amount of waste, fraud, and abuse in this program, not by consumers, but by providers. So more than 20 people that provided relay services have gone to jail for fraud. And we've had large providers that have been fined because they have enabled Nigerian scammers by negligence, to put it politely, to use IP relay services to impersonate U.S. persons when they committed credit card fraud for merchants that they called up. So we have to constantly watch for new scams that try to extract money from the government and others as well. Let me conclude. So we've had now, as probably is not news to any of you, it's essentially where finally all the technology that's being developed is now hitting scale. In many cases, it is no longer now a supplement to, but a displacement of technology that we've taken for granted for years. The existing telephone system, cable TV system, relay systems, 911 system, you name it. The old assumptions that we often had no longer hold. People don't have certain devices. You can't assume that certain things continue to work, let's say during a power outage. We also now have not just mainstream consumer applications, but also relay service and emergency services are converting to IP. I didn't talk about that here, but in the NAMO1 world, we have in the US for transition to NG NAMO1, in Europe, NG 112, that are essentially conversions of the legacy world to an all IP-based model. We also have a lot of churn and innovation going on, which is all good, except that it can also lead to fragmentation, so that what used to be universally assumed is no longer nearly as universal. And with that, I'll gladly take, let me get out of sharing mode here. And I'll gladly take questions if people still have patience for that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for that, Henning. And there's a couple of lots of questions. I'm going to abuse of my moderator chores here by asking a question, and that will give Jay Carpenter, who's first on the list, a chance to get into position to ask his. Henning, just a very brief question on my part, which is, why is fax still alive? Is it legitimate? Yeah, any comments at all on fax? Because to me, I find it's superfluous.
Yes. So from what we can tell, faxes tend to still dominate in two areas, namely the law and medicine. And from what I can tell, the reason for that is that it avoids, essentially creates a least common denominator for exchanging complex documents. And it avoids, and this is particularly in the medical field, you can just always fax the EKG, even if you don't have another means of transmitting it. And in the legal field, you have the advantage, perceived advantage, that it creates a transmission record, and, which is something I didn't appreciate, so you don't have to worry about that you would accidentally, when you send a Word file or PDF file, that you accidentally leave things in there that you'd rather not. Like a history of edits or other information that sometimes you don't see, but when you send it to somebody, they will use that against you. So I think it's diminishing, particularly with electronic health records. It's now getting easier, but interoperability between those is still dicey. So I see still a lot of faxing, particularly in the medical realm, and it's partially also because of HIPAA concerns. For some reason, faxes are seen as HIPAA compliant. Just sticking a PDF file on an email is not. Even though, and practically speaking, the security implications are probably not all that different. But for whatever perceptual reasons is, you can do one, but you probably would get fired if the medical assistant were to simply attach a medical record to an email and send it to somebody, to another doctor's office or hospital or whatever else it happens to be. So that, I think, is the reason why they stick around in those two areas and will probably be with us for some number of years, simply because neither sees much incentive to switching.
And that makes total sense to me. The only problem I have with faxes is that they would be very, very easy to counterfeit. However, anyway, that talks to caller ID and so on. And I don't want to hog this because a lot of people have questions. So let me see if Jay Carpenter is available to speak. Jay?
Hi, Randy. Thank you.
Okay, Jay, go ahead.
Thank you. Before I ask Henning a question, I would like to congratulate you, Randy, on the 500th VUC. I think this is an awesome service for the community, and yet again, you're delivering an awesome set of content to the community, so thank you.
Thanks, Jay. Go ahead.
Okay, Henning, you touched upon the numbering testbed workshop and the numbering testbed initiative that was launched earlier this year by the FCC. Would you mind giving an update on where the testbed initiative stands and what's transpired since the March 25th workshop that took place at the FCC?
Yep, and so We are still interested in pursuing that. We've had this little distraction of 1 million comments, namely VoIP internet stuff, which meant it has sucked up and this little merger that got dropped in a lap or two. So a lot of staff have been putting out fires of one sort or another, including myself. And so it's really been more sort of lack of internal resources of certain key individuals on that effort to push that forward. My goal after, and this is my kind of what I need to finish first, is the video relay service thing. My goal is that within, before the summer is out, that we'll pick that up again in that. There's also been, and you may be familiar with that a little bit, is that I'm trying to make sure that there are two other efforts that make that a little more challenging. Namely, one is the IPNNI effort within the SIP forum and ADIS. I don't know if you're familiar with that. This is about interconnection between networks, and numbering and routing plays a role with that. And I'm trying to make sure that we internally coordinate with those entities who are working on that. And secondly, there is another issue that you are well familiar with, most people probably not. We had a contract bid for one of the numbering administrators, a local number portability administrator, and that has been, and Jay will appreciate my under my putting it very politely, this has been not a smooth process in terms of lack of contention. There is a new entity that has been identified as prospective managing entity, but it's obviously in a very contentious and legal fight context. And so that has also made it somewhat more difficult to talk to certain key parties, simply because one party doesn't know what their role is going to be, and well, actually both parties don't quite know yet what their roles are going to be. And so you have a little bit of a sensitive area that I need to be respectful of. But it's not, it's still active. It just needs to be kicked into somewhat higher gear, and I'm hoping to do that soon.
Thank you, Henning. I think we're looking forward to the numbering testbed moving forward, and hopefully there'll be some folks that are in the VUC community that can get involved as well, because there's a ton of expertise here. So thank you for that update.
Yeah, I mean, I really hope that, not knowing who's all on the call, that, and I'd be happy to talk to any of you individually in much more detail than I had time today, is that there are interesting problems in areas that have not received as much attention. And as I said, with 3 or 4 that I mentioned was in some sense strategic, because I'm hoping that people say, that's something that I can help with, be it in emergency calling, be it in video relay service, other relay service and numbering and spoofing related issues. They're all deserving much more technical attention than they have been getting.
Okay, well, you definitely got some of the best talent in the world on this call, so you're talking to the right folks.
Thank you, Jay. We have 1 million questions here. Let's get it over to Ken Rice first, and then James will be next. Ken, you ready for us? See if Ken is unmuted. Ken.
Waiting like a cool spring.
Okay, is Ken able to? Well, James, you go ahead. And then
can you hear me now? There
we go. Okay, Ken Rice, go ahead, Ken.
Hi, Mr. Henning. Thank you for coming on today. I actually am one of the technology professionals that live really rural. And can you speak to rural broadband initiatives for just a moment?
Yeah, so let me try to do this in a way that, because it's this is a a topic that deserves more than a kind of a 1-minute answer. So let me try to give you some highlights. So rural broadband is generally been funded, for those of you who are not intimately familiar with that topic, in the U.S. by Universal Service Fund, so-called High Cost Loop Fund, about $2 billion or so a year. That's been generally given, again, with exceptions, to incumbent, either large or in some cases small rural so-called rate of return carriers that get money and then promise to build out broadband. So what we've been trying to do is make the process both more efficient and more effective. Efficient in the sense that we just started as a trial with hope of exploring that issue in greater depth as to scaling it up. A model that is more based on a reverse auction model, where we just started a $100 million trial where entities that are in high-cost areas, so we have a model that somebody else developed for us that says how much it would cost to deploy broadband in a particular area. In those areas that are unserved or underserved, unserved meaning there's no broadband, and underserved meaning is really only really low speed internet connectivity, more than modem, but not much more, like megabit or whatever. Those entities can bid on serving those areas, and they'll get funded for that. And we'll basically select the lowest cost areas for this initial trial, lowest bid areas, if you like. It's a little more complicated, but that's first approximation. And the idea is that we get robust broadband, which is beyond the current definition of what broadband is supposed to support is 4 megabits down, 1 megabit up, which obviously is not terribly exciting in terms of speeds. And so we're now looking at significantly higher speeds as a qualifying criteria for broadband support. The other thing which is happening where I think community where involvement is also by technical professionals is helpful is that what we've seen is a number of electric utilities, rural electric utilities, have decided they got poles, they got linemen, they got trucks, and so all they need is fiber. And so we've had indications of interest by a very large number of entities that have said that they might be interested as rural electric utilities to provide broadband services to their service areas in addition to electric service. And they're now eligible, which they didn't used to be, again, details I'll omit, but they're eligible in principle to serve those rural areas. So if you have if you live in an area with a rural electric co-op and they are not aware of that yet, although I think their trade association has been pretty active in beating that particular drum, might want to talk to them or offer your services as an expert in how to participate in that, because that might be a good way to get, in the longer term, again, it's not 100 million isn't going to solve that problem, but if that works, maybe we'll be able to scale it up to a pretty much heftier chunk of cash. Those entities can now become broadband providers and offer modern fiber-based broadband in rural communities. And as I said, I'd be happy to talk, to refer you. It's not my portfolio directly. Happy to refer you to the people who work on that. There will be webinars on that particular topic. So if you're interested, if you or somebody that you know is interested in that, they should check on the FCC calendar that there will be several webinars coming up explaining the application process, what the program is about, what the goals are, and so on.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ken. I think James Bodie has a few things to add to this. James?
Well, completely different things, in fact. Hi, Henning.
Hi, good to see you.
Calling from London, but we are, of course, US licensed operators as well, so being a global operator. But can I start off by saying how wonderful it is to see a CTO of the FCC with a big wodge of RFCs to his name. I can't explain what a warm glow that gives technical people like us. So congratulations on getting in there, and I think we can rely on you to sort out these bureaucrats in Washington. But anyway, to business. I thought your presentation was great, and I've kind of heard most of it before because I've listened to your stuff before. But one thing that you really didn't talk about was spectrum, and there's a lot going on in the spectrum area at the moment. And in particular, we're getting really enthusiastic about all the things that are being done now to open up usable spectrum to people like us. So all of a sudden, we're going to be seeing license-free or shared bands, which you can use for LTE, for example. And you didn't say anything about that in your speech, and perhaps you'd like to say a few words.
So sure, so that deserves at least another hour, not just the topic you mentioned, but generally on its own. But let me talk about that briefly. There seems to be, and I hinted at that in general, that the notion that we used to have in licensing, and this is not just US, it's everywhere, as you know, that every spectrum band was assigned to a specific use category. And now we're moving in exclusive use, except for relatively small bands of sort of so-called unlicensed, which really isn't quite the right name either, because you're still licensed in this more indirect way. But we're moving towards an environment simply because there is no more spectrum available, at least at frequencies that most people like to work in. It's kind of below the 5 gigahertz band at the moment. We're moving towards a database-based sharing model in that. So that's already happening to some limited extent in the TV white spaces model. So this is the 600, 700 megahertz, primarily 600 megahertz band. And it will be happening in the so-called 3.5 gigahertz band. So the model, and I'll say it for, you probably know that, but others may have not tracked that closely, is that you essentially end up with 2 or 3 levels of access. Like one is the incumbent, so in 3.5 gigahertz bands, this happen to be radars, so not traditional communication. And in other bands, it might be military communication or weather satellites, or there's all kinds of things that are in those bands, lightly used, or geographically constrained use, but you can't just kick them out, at reasonable cost, particularly because you can't tell them where else to go. It isn't just on open spaces that you can say vacate and move to some other place. So the model generally has been one of a database system that would essentially separate us, if you think of it as multiple priority levels, and that's a subject of discussion within the 3.5 and possibly other bands that emerge as suitable for that. So the idea is that in a particular area, a device would query based on its geographic location the database, get an answer back, here's a channel that's available to you, and would then use temporarily that channel for some limited time period on a contention basis, meaning they have to contend with other users and non-exclusive access in that. And I suspect we'll see more of that in bands that are being partially vacated by, or at least made available to new operators or new entities. The challenge there is that we've typically done that only for, in the 3.5, less so in the 600 megahertz band, for relatively low power transmitters, typically indoors or like kind of Wi-Fi-like ranges. It's going to be much harder to do that at longer ranges, like miles or so, that you would find in a cellular type of network. Now, will it solve the spectrum problem in general? Probably not, but it will be one way to more intensively use bands that have still important legacy technology or geographically constrained, like naval radars. You don't really have those anywhere except for coasts, but use those in ways that are more geographically efficient without spending billions of dollars of moving the incumbents out of there.
Yeah, you know what, the bands that I'm particularly interested in are the bands that these things use.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that the exclusive use model these days is just totally out of date. It's broken, and it's being used by the big cellular operators as a means of squeezing other people out. But then again, as a smaller mobile operator, I probably would say that. But I would like to see a model introduced whereby the big operators that have paid millions, billions of dollars for primary use of spectrum are allowed to use it as top priority users, but there is a mechanism whereby if they're not using it, then other people can. One of the things that makes me really quite angry here in UK is that I live in a valley, a very rural and very beautiful valley, and there's absolutely no mobile coverage there. But I can't do anything in the valley because the mobile network operators in UK have bought the right to use exclusively access that spectrum. So I can't do anything there. And that's a big problem for me because I would like to put a string of femto cells all the way at the valley and everybody would be happy because they'd be open femto cells open to all networks. But I can't because I can't use the usable spectrum at the moment. And that really grips me. And we're here in the 21st century. This is not rocket science. We can do it. So,
yeah.
Sorry, that's my...
More of a, again, whether this will be applying to more of a legacy cellular frequencies I don't think is not currently being actively discussed, but certainly in the 3.5 gigahertz band, which would be particularly is designed for femtocell type of applications, there's very much a use it or lose it type of thing, or use it or when somebody else can use it type of model envisioned exactly for the reasons you want to give other operators that either want to fill in or that quicker a model that works. The fear, I suspect, to some extent, is you don't want to get into a situation where you license spectrum at relatively high cost to the incumbents, and they feel like that they get the squatters' right problem, namely that entities that say, well, and it took them 5 years to actually get here, and now I have my towers here, and I'm not going anywhere. And so this is as much everybody needs to be assured that this doesn't, every such reassignment back to the license holder becomes a long, drawn-out food fight that increases cost and so on. So we've had a little bit of that problem, not so much with cellular, but in other areas where people are given spectrum, in a sense, for free, and then they suddenly believe that they own it, even though there was an implied notion and a legal notion that really you don't own spectrum wherever you are. Those rights are not property rights in the classical sense, but they are more limited rights that are subject to withdrawal. But in practical terms, as we've seen with TV incentive auction issue, is once somebody has it for long enough, it's hard to take them out of their hands, particularly if it happens to be a sympathetic or powerful incumbent. Yeah,
and there are some very powerful cellular operators with lots of lobbying power in Washington at this moment in time. Yeah. We know that. Anyway, thank you for your very candid and very clever answer. I think the 3.5 gig bands in particular are going to give us the ability to get in there and try out techniques, these spectrum sharing type techniques, which possibly we can then extend into other more useful bands later on. I think it's going to work brilliantly well. And I think I'm personally getting very excited about what we can do with LTE in 3.5 gigs. All we need is a big pile of devices with 3.5 gig radios in that we can use them in. Anyway, the other bit of spectrum which we get incredible amounts of value out of are the 2.4 and the 5 gig Wi-Fi bands. They must be the most heavily used and most productive lumps of spectrum in the whole of the electromagnetic spectrum, I guess.
Yep.
So we just need more of that.
Yeah, and we'll certainly probably see at least some spectrum in after the TV incentive auction, so which would be in the 600 megahertz band, and probably there's also, as you know, higher frequency bands available as well that are people starting to look at in the 60 gigahertz band, for example. That might be that seems to be, at least for indoor applications and some other more niche type of things, quite useful. So
yes, brilliant. Anyway, I've taken enough of your time. I'm sure there are a gazillion other people queuing to ask you penetrating questions.
Okay, I'm happy to move on to the next question then.
Okay, Henning, thank you very much for taking all this time. I'm looking for a question that came up quite a while ago in IRC, but before we do, let me see if Tim Panton may have
always good for a good question.
Yes, although he says that part of it got answered. But Tim, if you
I was really that James's question pretty much covered the same sort of ground I was thinking about, which is really about, maybe you could talk about where the white space experiment got to, the TV white space and the the database allocation you talked about a little bit. But do you have a feel for how that experiment turned out?
Yeah, so it's in some sense now it's a commercial service. In a sense, it's no longer a number of database operators that are certified, and you can buy equipment and so on, and it's not just a limited time experiment. So in a sense, that you can do production. I would say my personal opinion is that it has been both more and less successful than maybe some people had hoped for. More successful in the sense that it has demonstrated that database-based sharing is technically implementable, that you can get multiple operators to do that, and at least so far there haven't really been any major interference issues that maybe some people had feared. The less successful piece has been for a variety of reasons, the number of actual commercial users at scale, and that you would find in a national scale, has really been pretty modest. There's been a few, but they might not, has this become a third unlicensed band, in addition to the 2.4 and 5.8 band, or 5 gigahertz band. So the interesting question is, why is that? My perception, and I've not been as closely involved about, is that it's twofold. One is that initial equipment availability wasn't all that great, so it was difficult for people to actually build those networks. And still, compared to the amount of equipment you can get in 2.4 and 5.8, it's pretty limited. Secondly is one where the spectrum that is available in terms of total bandwidth is not great. When you get good reach, although that's limited by power, so you don't get really long distances, but you could get a wall penetration, for example, which is more difficult with the higher frequencies. But the bands you have, since we're 6 megahertz band, you're not going to get 100 megabits out of those. And so it's been probably a little disappointing in terms of scaling. And I said simply as a replacement for wireless internet service providers, it hasn't quite been sufficient in terms of available bandwidth. There's been proposals, if you look at some of the incentive auction discussion, to create somewhat wider bands in the bands that are supposed to be auctioned off for that. And that might make the same model more attractive in terms of achievable bandwidth, and then you get more, maybe more take up on that. So in some sense, the biggest practical success has really been in paving the way for spectral management models outside of the TV white spaces band, because just issue you run into TV white spaces is that where you want spectrum, namely in densely populated areas, you typically have lots of TV stations, so there isn't really a whole lot of available spectrum. And it's areas, deep rural areas, there just isn't as much interest, and there's other spectrum available that is lightly licensed currently that wireless internet service providers can get that provides more bandwidth than the TV white spaces does. So that's really been, I think, a combination of learning experience, shall we say, that are useful in and of itself, even if the number of TV white space users has been probably more modest than some people have hoped.
Cool, thank you. I think I agree with you definitely on the equipment problem. I mean, my limited experiments with that, the equipment was expensive and not really optimized for what I wanted to do, in protocol wise, which was interesting. Right, you tend to think IP is IP, but by the time it goes out over the radio, it doesn't necessarily suit your usage.
Yep, and that's been, again, it took a long time before even, modestly useful equipment emerged, and it's still somewhat of a niche market. One of the things that happened in the 2.4 and 5.8 is that you had really two mass markets, namely the residential and the commercial market, which then people who build more long distance type of or specialty equipment for carriers, they could leverage the same chipsets and antennas and all of that. And that never really hasn't quite happened in the TV white spaces world. And so I think that's part of it, just simply because it's not, it hasn't really seen much usage inside the home or the enterprise. Okay.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tim. There was a question. Okay, first of all, Henning, I don't know how much time you have. Do you have a few more minutes?
Yes, I do have a few more minutes. I probably have a hard stop in about 5 or so. Before
all right, let's try to get all this out of the way then. A very quick one, I think, from Fred, who typed this in hours ago in IRC, and if we can get by it, fine. And what he asked is, my question would be what they feel could be done about swatting, S-W-A-T-I-N-G. And I looked that up. I was trying to find what it meant. And unfortunately, I did not. Can somebody jump in if we...
So I'm guessing here swatting is generally, if I'm, and whoever asked to correct me, if that's not what they were referring to, is a abuse of 911 where somebody calls in the local, calls 911 and says, I'm being held hostage by a bunch of goons, and it turns out that the number was spoofed, and the number typically refers to, at least in the LA area, it was typically referring to some high-profile celebrity, and so suddenly you have a SWAT team showing up at that person's house who is absolutely clueless as to why you have heavily gunmen showing up at his doorstep. And whoever does this thinks it's really cute. A trick to play. It obviously has, besides just the waste of resources, has potential of going horribly wrong. And as far as I know, nobody has gotten hurt so far, but that's been luck more than anything else. I mean, somebody only has to make one wrong move and really bad things could happen. So what I would argue is that, again, this is the number spoofing issue, that we really do need to prevent number spoofing reliably. And also, one of the things that has happened that I don't know for all of us, whether that has a factor in some of the swatting incident, some of the mischief that's 911 by kind of good intentions problem, namely that in the US, and that's true in other countries as well, so-called non-serviced initialized phones, so phones that are not subscribed to carrier, that may have been on a carrier at some point, kind of the phones placed in drawers and forgotten, can still dial 911. The idea was that you could keep one of those phones in a drawer or your glove box, even if you didn't have a paid cell phone, you could give it to an elderly relatives. Police departments used to hand it out to shut-ins at home that may not have had cellular service or otherwise needed an additional way to reach 911. And those have turned out to be used less for those legitimate purposes and much more for nefarious purposes of people impersonating callers. They couldn't spoof a number in that case, but it's essentially an anonymous 911 call with all of the predictable consequences. And so we are looking at reversing that idea that I said probably was a good idea when relatively few people had cell phones and there were no entry-level phone plans available, and it's turning out to be not such a hot idea anymore given the abuse.
Okay, let's move on because Bernard Bobo. I'm getting some echo here. I don't know why. Bernard, if you can hear me, go ahead.
I can hear you. Early on, Henning, some groups such as the FCC TAC had talked about a date certain for an IP PSTN transition, and certainly you've outlined many of the complex issues involved. Could you talk a little bit about how long you think the transition might take, what kind of a transition it will be? Will there ever be a date certain?
Henning, you need to unmute yourself, sorry, because the echo was coming from you. Sorry.
Okay. So, Henning, you have to unmute yourself on the top part. Mouse over the top icons and unmute yourself.
Can't you do it, Emil?
No, he can't. So the top middle.
Yeah, the top of the...
And then
the toolbar, there's a unmute button. I muted you, Henning. I'm sorry. The echo was coming from you, but only you can unmute yourself. So,
but it's not visible until you move your mouse.
Move your mouse up to the top of the big...
I got it.
Okay, we're good. Go ahead, please.
Okay, good. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
So let me talk about the 3 questions I think I heard, namely, will there be a date certain? How is it in that? And what does the transition mean in some sense? And what am I... all around that topic. And I think people, first of all, the TAC, I should point out, maybe that's the first one, is that the TAC is an advisory committee. While we pay attention, certainly, and they do generally very useful work, and it's various guises. They have lots of working groups, different topics, spectrum and PSTN and so on, that vary. They don't make decisions for the commission, and even if we were to declare a transition date, generally speaking, we don't get involved in mandating the technology choices of individual companies. So it was never really was reported as such as if we could just wave a wand and say, as of 2018, we are going to have all IP services. Also, I think what people have started to recognize is, and I didn't really get into that as much, is that there is when people talk about the transition, like I said, there's really several going on, but there's also one that is really what's happening in many ways is that there's a customer displacement transition and there is a technology upgrade transition, and that is happening, the latter is happening in 2 ways. Namely, one is end-to-end IP, where you truly have an all IP, DSL, reverse VDSL, cable, fiber, whatever, spectrum wireless. And that seems to be happening in many of the places where there's still wireline phone service used, is that you actually have a hybrid model, namely IP to the switch. And then you have a traditional landline, analog as it was since when Bell days, that runs into the home for people who don't have broadband, which still we only have about 80% or so broadband usage. So 20% of households don't have broadband. They would have a traditional phone line, even though it's all IP once it reaches the first switch. So is that a transition or is that not? And what I'm gathering from many of the wireline-only phone companies, ones that don't have a wireless operation on the side, so to say, or dominating, that model is likely to be fairly common. So what I do see happening is more limited transition stages in subsets. Namely, one is interconnection. I mentioned that. That at some point, depending on the legal outcome of various discussions, is depending on what interconnection obligations are, assuming that for a moment that there could be legal obligations to interconnect, that those would transition from a TDM obligation to an IP obligation. In a sense, currently almost all interconnection between providers, I should say almost all, a large fraction of it, is still being done via TDM circuits, even for providers that are otherwise all IP, for a variety of reasons. And secondly, but you could transition to a model where you have a IP-dominated interconnection model, namely, then you can get end-to-end IP, you can get HD voice, you can get video possibly, and so on. So that may happen at some defined date, because that's a legal obligation issue as well, that has more definable parameters. The other one is related to the numbering system. If we make a transition along the lines that we discussed at the numbering workshop, that will also have transition dates that may well be that may well have a more date certain, as opposed to a more gradual kind of slide model where you have a landing path, so to say, to an all IP model. And the U.S. telecom market, unlike, say, most other countries, because of its such diversity of providers, making hard cutovers for anything is really difficult. And we still have analog TV out there, even though it's been a number of years since we did the digital TV transition. We have some low-power TV stations and translators that are still operating in analog. So these things tend to take a lot longer than people anticipated.
That was quite a comprehensive answer.
Okay, so we're still a little bit echo back, but Henning, I want to thank you very, very much. Fantastic to join us.
Appreciate it. Thank you for all the interesting questions.
And maybe next year at this time.
Yep. We're happy to be back. And I'll be happy to talk about Spectrum at that point if people are interested as well. And anything else that might be relevant. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Henning. You're a star. You get our vote. If we had to vote for the CTO of the FCC, you get my vote.
Sounds good. Appreciate it. And I'll see some of you in person and some of you at other events as well.
I also wanted to add in my thanks, Henning. Just for the record, Henning Schulzrinne is the name that I've been seeing on RFC since I actually started reading them in 2001. So it's been an honor to actually know. Thank you for everything that you have contributed to the community and for everything that you're doing now.
Been my pleasure. So. I'll seeing you all later then.
Later.
And that worked quite well. Are we still live? We are still live, aren't we?
Well, if Randy's muted himself, but apart from that, yes, I think we are.
Yeah. And it's great that the echo cancellation.
All right.
On the
Sorry about that. We're still live. I just want to make sure I didn't mute myself. Somebody else muted me, and it wasn't me echoing. But Emil, thank you. Emil actually set this call up with Henning, and that's fantastic. It was really, really interesting. Even the presentation, some of you have seen it. Okay, fine. But there's a huge amount of interesting information in it. We're glad to be able to present that on YouTube. And I'm going to leave the audio up here, and we'll leave ZipDX for a while if anybody wants to talk. I personally have You want to see my bottle of champagne? I don't know. Is it worth doing?
Yes.
Yes, we want to see your champagne.
Because this is VUC 500, ladies and gentlemen. Hold on.
Yeah,
Woo!
we want to see Mrs. Resnick, Madame Resnick, come and crack the bottle and sit on your lap whilst grasping a glass of champagne.
She could break the bottle over a server or something.
Steady. I thought you were going to say something else then, but probably a good thing you didn't. So I thought it was really good the way everything held together on JVB, which only just grew the SIP back-end capability, a week ago, Emil?
Yes, indeed.
And it's just a mark.
Well, actually, it's still being added. It's still being developed. So
yeah, little things like sorting out the echo cancellation so that it doesn't.
That's not us. That's not us. It's not us. That's it. Sometimes Chrome does that. I didn't.
Yeah, it's Chrome. Yeah.
However, what's us is the participants got muted every now and then without them knowing that. That's us. That's actually me.
Well, we worked that out. You're the man with the star. So
I think what happens with Chrome is that it.
Oh look, bottle.
Bottle.
Yeah, I hit. Something hit the back button, and then I was back in the testing room suddenly. Anyway, are we still?
Are you going to crack it open, or are you just going to wait?
No, let him drink it quietly to himself. I want to spoil his moment.
I want to hear and see it go.
Remember, we're still live. We're still live on.
Yeah, we have to stay live, and let me get this happening here.
Well, it's all.
Of course, if it spills on my guitar, I'll be in trouble.
Are we still recording?
Yes. Well, I don't know. I'm not recording.
Yes, we are.
On ZipDX, yeah. I mean on.
And in that case, I want to have it for the record, Randy. Congrats once more for setting this whole thing up and leading it. And congrats to Michael and everyone who's been helping making it happen. Tim and James and everyone on ZipDX. This is really quite an accomplishment. This is the show for voice over IP. You're distracting me for real-time communication that everyone knows about, that everyone wants to listen and where everyone can find a very informative and educational subject. So congrats to everyone. This is really quite an achievement.
Well, it is an achievement just to show that we've arrived. I mean, how many other funny little shows like this could get the CTO of the FCC to turn up? I mean, it's pretty unprecedented, isn't it, really?
Well, that's thanks.
I don't know about funny little shows, but I know about pretty serious big shows that can get it, and that's VUC is one of them.
Thanks, Emil. Well, you were instrumental, of course. Let's do the close up here for.
Yeah.
Okay, here she comes. Well, I already paid for a brand new keyboard once with this kind of thing. Oh, the hand coming in with the glass. Okay.
The hand, yeah.
Hey, wait! You have to wait. Come back. Come back here.
You have to zoom back out again.
Yeah, can you show the glass again? I want to take a picture. That looks too.
Well, wait a second.
Yeah, you have to have your glamorous assistant.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get.
Yeah, Emil knows all about this. It's how you win prizes at dangerous demos. You've got to have a dangerous and very glamorous assistant. There we go. We're standing by for the big explosion.
Yeah, well, we need to cue the music here. Okay, here we go. Ready? That's it. What's with the? Come on. Look over here and get the hand in here. All right, wait.
Well, you have to zoom back out again.
Yeah, all right. We'll zoom back on.
Oh,
and there's the hand. The hand biting the hand that feeds us.
The hand of the king.
Wait a minute. All right, we ready?
Yeah, here we go.
Just a second. Let me get the. What is this thing called already? Sound something. All right, bear with us, folks. This is VUC 500. You need a seat?
No, I'm okay. I'm getting
All right, hold on.
Do you want me to jet over there to Bordeaux and just to help you out?
Yeah, you should. All right, wait. Where's Jokes Sly? Oh, no, that's not the. All right, here we go. Almost, right? Wait a minute.
How many VUCers does it take to open a bottle?
Yeah, really. All right. Come on. Where is this thing? Here we go. Ready? Here we go. Can you see that? Oh, look out. Ah!
Oh, Henning got it on his keyboard. Yay! New keyboard. Now I'm feeling thirsty.
Who isn't?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I wish I could show you what's on the floor.
But I'll tell you what, Emil, we'll celebrate in Chicago next week.
Yes.
I hope
Have fun out there, you guys.
I hope you're feeling hungry.
Cheers, Randy.
Hey, everybody.
All right, gentlemen.
All kidding aside.
Probably wind.
Go ahead.
Someday.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, all seriousness aside, as Steve Ellen used to say, thanks, everybody. I mean, this would be useless without every one of you. Tim, you know, James, Andy, Michael, Emil, what's your name? Yeah. All of you folks, and many people who I haven't named, like Bob Bowles. I see Anthem is in the call. Paul.
Carl.
Carl.
Where's
Carl? Where is Carl? Carl. Damn it.
He's got to be in there somewhere.
Didn't have a question. He's unmuted. He's there, but he didn't have a question. Jay, thank you for your questions. I'm looking over. Let's see who's in here. Mention the people who are here. That's the way to go. Yeah, Randy. All right. Sean, I know. Sean Farrell is there. He's been around for several times. A lot of people come in and out, but thanks to everybody. Hey, and here's to you guys. Here's to you, sweetheart.
Now muted. Star 6 to unmute. 17 other participants.
Star 6 right here.
Oh no! Hang on. Oh no!
Oh, why don't I mute?
Yeah, mute Bodie. That'll be fun.
All right, Michael. That's probably YouTube. But
All
hey,
right.
thank you,
Here we
everybody. Great.
Take
Thanks,
it
Randy.
easy.
Out of curiosity, Emil, have you got plans for recording?